Good afternoon, and welcome to the Michigan Department of Education's Winter 2023 Teaching Comprehensive History Instruction webinar series. I am Corinne Edwards, and I have the privilege of serving as the Director of the Office of Educational Supports here at the Michigan Department of Education. This is the sixth topic in a series that the department is offering associated with the comprehensive teaching of U.S. and world history. This series is the vision of our State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Dr. Michael Rice. It is through this vision that we advance our efforts to provide an assurance of Michigan students having opportunities to learn history from a comprehensive stance. As such, the MDE remains committed to the teaching of history through diverse viewpoints while highlighting historical movements and moments that have shaped our nation. Today, we are fortunate to have an exceptional presenter, Dr. LaShawn Harris, Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University, back again to round out our learning on the Equal Rights Movement, National and Michigan Views. We welcome Dr. Harris back for her third installment of this topic and eagerly await today's presentation. As educators, we have the responsibility to teach the full breadth of history to our children. This broad effort will help us learn more about historical movements, events, and peoples that are part of the complex, diverse history of our country and world, and by extension, help you explore the same comprehensive history with your students. We are grateful for our presenter today and truly thank her for sharing her expertise and assisting in the growth of knowledge and understanding of this topic amongst our educators. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank the Teaching Comprehensive History webinar series team, including our ASL interpreter, Ms. Marilyn C., for its continued efforts in identifying and selecting key topics and for arranging and organizing this virtual space for us to gather and learn. Finally, I'd like to thank you, our attendees, for joining us on this teaching and learning journey. Thank you all for your intentionality, interest, and courage in support of our students, which we refer to as our professional true north, and the preparation for their comprehensive understanding of our country and its history. And now I will turn it over to Renee Garcia, our Director of the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at the MDE, to usher us forward into today's session. Renee?
Thank you, Dr. Edwards. I appreciate that. Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us. I am Renee Garcia, and I'm the Director with the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. We are thrilled to have all of you in attendance as we continue the Comprehensive History webinar series. Before I turn over the presentation to today's presenter, I have some housekeeping announcements. Participants' video, audio, and chat features have been turned off. Questions for our presenter may be added using the Q&A feature. Questions will be addressed toward the end of this event as time permits. If time does not permit, questions will be addressed through email. We will provide links to resources using the chat feature throughout today's presentation. This presentation is being recorded and will be available on the Teaching Comprehensive History website. If you would like sketchies for attending today, please be sure to sign in on the Sketchies link that will be provided on several occasions in the chat during this presentation. You can adjust your speaker view options anytime by selecting the view button at the top right of the Zoom screen. At the conclusion of the webinar today, a survey will be emailed to participants. Please share your feedback as it helps us to inform future webinars. Closed captioning and American Sign Language interpreter have been provided as indicated by Dr. Edwards. If closed captioning isn't automatically available, select the Show Subtitle option. Again, our interpreter today is Marilyn Corlett. Without further delay, please welcome Dr. LaShawn Harris. Dr. Harris is an Associate Professor of History at Michigan State University and Assistant Editor of the Journal of African American History. Her area of expertise includes 20th century African American and Black women's histories. We are thrilled to have Dr. Harris with us today. And with that, Dr. Harris, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Dr. Edwards and Ms. Garcia, for those gracious introductions. I'll just begin by sharing my screen. Thank you for to everyone who is viewing as well as listening. Today, I would like to talk a little bit about Ida B. Wells. And if you were tuning in last week, I talked a little bit about the National Association of Colored Women, which was an organization, which is an organization. The organization is still around, but the organization was founded in 1896. And it's an organization that addresses issues that are important to African-American women. And Ida B. Wells was one of those really staunch, members that advocated for civil rights as well as human rights. But I want to focus more so on Ida B. Wells as an anti-lynching crusader. I'll talk a little bit more about this beautiful doll, but if you don't know, Ida B. Wells, Mattel has a history collection, and the Ida B. Wells dolls debuted maybe a couple of years ago. So if you're interested in buying this really beautiful doll, you can go straight to Mattel or you can buy it at Target, actually. So let's talk just a little bit about lynching for a moment. This was one of the causes that Ida B. Wells took up, and she took that cause up really seriously. So lynching is an unlawful murder by a mob of people. Throughout history, dominant groups have used lynchings as a way of controlling various groups of people, particularly African Americans. A lynching is the public killing of an individual who has not received any due process. These executions were often carried out by lawless mobs, though police officers did participate in lynchings under the pretext of justice. So if we're thinking about numbers, I want to draw your attention to some of the lynching numbers. Roughly between 1882 in 1968, over 4,000 Americans were lynched in the US. And these are reported cases of reported lynchings. The Tuskegee report puts that number at, again, over 4,700. In terms of the numbers of Blacks, we're talking about over 3,400, whites over 1,200. The lynching numbers are often used by African American and white freedom fighters to lobby Congress to pass an anti-lynching bill, which never happens. And this fight to secure federal legislation to make lynching a federal crime is sought after, fought over during the 1910s, the 1920s, the 1930s, the 1940s, the 1950s, and 1960s. This never happens up until recently in 2022, and I'll mention that towards the end of this talk. The NAACP's numbers between 1889 and 1920s, again, over 3,400 African Americans, total Americans lynched, and over 2,500 African Americans lynched. Other persons lynched during the early 20th century include Mexican Americans. The first recorded cases of lynchings of ethnic Mexicans in the United States emerged during the late 1840s and continued throughout the 1930s. Although the exact number of lynchings remain largely unknown, historians estimate that roughly 5,000 Mexicans and Mexican Americans were killed during this period. The majority of cases are found within the border regions of Texas, California, Arizona, and New Mexico. And if we're thinking about more contemporary numbers when it comes to lynching, we can look at a study that was done by Brian Stevenson's Equal Justice Initiative, and he puts the number of lynchings between 1877 and 1950, at least in 12 southern states, at over 4,000. So now I want to draw your attention to the perpetrators and the reasons for lynching. So if we're thinking about the perpetrators, these are people from various different various different classes. And those people would include skilled laborers, white collar workers, members of a rising middle class, managers, petty merchants, salesmen, jailers, police officers, tradesmen, as well as white women and white children. So let's talk a little bit about the reasons for lynching, at least within the context of African Americans. So why are Blacks lynched? And these are just a few factors. Wrong place at the wrong time, accused of criminal activity, meaning retribution for sexual assault, theft, murder, and assault, cases of mistaken identity, breaching the social mores of white society or the American South, being Black, Blacks asserting their citizenship and autonomy over their own lives, threatening white masculinity and patriarchy. And really, it's not about the crime necessarily, but it's about a violation of racial hierarchy. And I like to tell students in thinking about lynching, I like to describe to them really what does lynching reinforce and what does it reflect. So in terms of what it reinforces and what it reflects, number one, lynching reinforces and reflects and perpetuates the role of extra-legal violence in Southern culture and American culture. Lynching aims at intimidating Blacks into submission and loyalty. Lynching reinforces and reflects whites' desires to witness public executions and desire for immediate punishment and retribution that can be carried out by them. Lynching reinforces and restores masculine dominance and patriarchy, reinforces female subordination. Lynching reinforces an investment in maintaining a strict racial and gender code and hierarchy. And lynching reflects whites' outrage over what they saw as a really changing society and moral decline and spread of crime. They viewed this as a direct assault on their integrity, their honor, and their homes. These fears about their own personal and social vulnerabilities ultimately led them to strike out viciously and excessively against the objects of their terror, which were Black bodies. And in teaching lynching, and we can teach lynching, domestic violence in a host of different ways. But in teaching this particular subject, which I like to teach not in one lecture, but over several lectures, usually 2 to 3, what I try to do is I try to humanize victims, and I try to put the numbers that I just kind of rattled off to you within context. So humanizing victims and putting these things within context. So by humanizing, I'm thinking about like what the numbers reveal and what they don't reveal. So if you look at the numbers, what lynching numbers reveal or what the stories about lynchings reveal oftentimes are the names of victims, the ages, the alleged crimes, and stories behind the lynchings. But the numbers, as you can see, as you already know, fall short, because most of the numbers tell us about, again, the alleged criminality, as well as moments of sheer terror. What lynching numbers do not reveal, they don't reveal anything about the victim. They don't reveal anything about families and the broader African-American community. But I think that you can do some of this through film as well as art and music. What we don't know about lynching victims, if we're thinking just about the numbers, are who were the victims, again, information about the families, the impact of racial trauma and violence on a community. The numbers don't show the human costs behind the nation's legal and political failings of its Black citizens. Victims of lynchings are often lose their identities in death. They went from being fathers and mothers and husbands and wives and sons and daughters and sisters and brothers to quote unquote generic lynching victims. It is important to go beyond the statistics, beyond the numbers. We must reckon with lynching victims and understand what happened to their families and communities after their killings. Failing to do so continues to dehumanize and objectify victims. So I want to give you a few examples of just some of the artwork and some of the pictures that I use when teaching students about lynching. So usually there came a time where I would show students lynching photos. And in lynching photos, you have this, if you have the space, you can explain a whole bunch of things that are happening in the photos. I tend not to use full lynching photos, particularly whites looking at bodies, especially if I don't know the context, especially if I don't have information about victims. But what I do show students are newspaper accounts about lynchings. And I also tend to show them the people who participate in lynchings. And I'm particularly drawn by women and children, young and old, who attend lynchings. It's important to note that lynchings are like an American pastime, right? It's like going to a baseball game. It's important to know that lynchings are not, you know, or are not just spontaneous. A lot of them are organized, and a lot of lynchings are publicized way in advance, even within newspapers. And I'll give you an example of that. So here you have a couple of newspaper accounts. Again, not advertising for a lynching, but reports about a lynching. And again, you have a picture of women and children, women and girls participating. And by participation, I mean attending a lynching. By participation, I mean, playing with the body, mutilating the body, cutting a souvenir off of the body. That could be a body part or a piece of clothing. Another good imageries when it comes to lynchings. Let me, if I can move this down here. Here we have these women. These are African-American women who are Howard University students in Washington, D.C., and they are protesting outside of the White House. They are calling for federal legislation for lynching. The second photo is a group of African Americans burying a lynching victim, which is, again, if you think about how the community is impacted, I think photos like this explains what a loved one or what a community person meant to the larger and broader community. And here again, you have these are two separate pictures, but I know they look like they're pushed, they're one photo, but these are pictures of people who attend lynchings. And again, if you look at the photos, there are a variety of people who attend these lynchings, including young children and young boys and young girls. And for young children, it becomes a sort of teaching ground or training ground in terms of how African Americans can be treated and should be treated if they step out of their quote unquote place. I recommend this video and this book, Without Sanctuary: Lynching Photography in America. This is by James Allen, and this is him here. He does a really great, I can't play this for you now, but he does a great lecture on lynching and about the book on C-SPAN. And this particular book is a short documentary, which is maybe about 5 or 6 minutes long. It's not necessarily good for, I don't think, K-12, but it's a good tool for educators in terms of how you can teach lynching and express different things. The thing that I like about Without Sanctuary, the book, as well as the documentary, is that James Allen talks about the reproductions of violence and how oftentimes souvenirs from a killing become postcards, or they become cartoons, they become scenes in movies. So he really stresses the kind of popular culture that emerges after a lynching. Another way, I think a good way of talking about lynching is not just through photos, but also through poetry and music. So I want to bring your attention to this song, which I think many people know. This is called Strange Fruit. And Strange Fruit was written by this man in the middle. His name is Abel Maripol. And Abel Maripol was a labor leader. He was a radical leader. Some people would say that he was a member of the Communist Party. And Abel Maripol, and he was a teacher. He was a high school teacher in the Bronx in New York City. And Abel Maripol writes this poem in the 1930s called Strange Fruit. And the poem originally appeared in a communist publication called New Masses. And Maripol is inspired to write this particular poem after he saw the photograph of the lynching of two men in Marion, Indiana in 1930. And the name of those two men that were lynched were Thomas Shipp and Abram Smith. By the late 1930s, we see this poem, Strange Fruit, set to music and sung by Eleanor Fagan, also known as Billie Holiday. Now, you may be wondering who these two children are in this particular photo. These are Maripol's adopted sons, and they are the sons of Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who were put to death in 1953 in Sing Sing, at the Sing Sing prison in upstate New York for spying. So they were indicted, convicted, and prosecuted for spying or selling secrets to the Russians. So I'm just going to play a little bit of Strange Fruit if you've never heard the song before. If you're interested in the history of the song, as well as Billie Holiday's entanglement with the United States government about the song and the war on drugs, I would definitely recommend reading her book, Lady Sings the Blues, a co-authored book, Lady Sings the Blues, but you can read both. You can read this, and you can also look at the Hulu movie starring Audra Day. So I'll just play a little bit of Strange Fruit.
Hello, to this special call. Strange Fruit. Southern trees, they're strange fruit. Blood on the leaves and blood at the root. Black bodies swinging in the southern breeze. Strange fruit hanging from the poplar trees. Pastoral scene of the gallant South, the bulging eyes and the twisted mouth, scent of magnolia, sweet and fresh. Then the sudden smell of burning flesh. Here is a fruit for the crows to pluck, for the rain to gather, for the wind to suck, for the sun to rock, for the tree to dry. Here is a strange and bitter cry.
So Strange Fruit is a really popular song. It was Billie Holiday's first protest song, and it was her only protest song. And the song has been widely covered by various different artists over the course of the 20th century, including Diana Ross, Annie Lennox from the Eurythmics, Sting from the Police, India Arie, who is a R&B singer, Nina Simone. I think most people know Nina Simone. Barbara Streisand, Judy Garland here in the corner, Ella Fitzgerald, jazz singer Nancy Wilson, and Audra McDowell. So the other thing that I like to show students are, newspaper, if we're thinking about primary sources, news clippings about lynchings, as well as news clippings that show that lynchings were often orchestrated. So here, this picture right here, a man was lynched yesterday. This is outside of the NAACP's Fifth Avenue office in Lower Manhattan. And oftentimes when somebody was lynched, the NAAC would hang this banner, this flyer outside of their office. And here, the bottom, Negro woman and son, this is the lynching of the 1910s lynching of Laura Nelson and her son, L.D. Nelson. There's a famous picture of them hanging from a bridge in Oklahoma. I typically don't show lynching photos, but I think most people have seen this particular photo. And here's another, this right here, 3,000 will burn. John Hartfield will be lynched at by an Elksville mob by 5 o'clock this afternoon. This is at the top, the Crisis magazine. This is the magazine for the NAACP, and they are reprinting this from the Jackson Daily News. So here we have an advertisement, if you will, the paper telling the citizens of Jackson and other places, wherever this paper is circulated, that there will be a lynching on a particular date at a particular time. So we think about complicity and who is complicit in lynchings. It's not just the people who actually just attend. It's not just the people who put the ropes around folks' necks, but it's also the people who are coming to attend. It's also the people who are the newspapers, the media. If you also look, at the bottom, it says Governor Bilbo of Mississippi says he is powerless to prevent it. Again, this is an advertisement, and the paper makes it clear that the governor of Mississippi knew that this person was going to be lynched. So again, if you think about complicity, a lot of people outside of the lynching party itself are complicit in the lynching of somebody. In terms of secondary sources, I would draw your attention to this book. This is a really, really excellent book for educators, not students necessarily. It's entitled At the Hands of Persons Unknown, the Lynching of Black America by Philip Dre, a really, really beautifully written book, lacks academic jargon, just really accessible in terms of language, and draws out the complexities and dynamics of lynching, mostly focusing on victims and their families. I've mentioned a lot about victims and families. I mention this because I feel that there is little scholarship and little attention is paid to those who have to carry the burden of grieving and at the same time embark in social justice movements. I think that many scholars today are interested in thinking about the everyday aftershocks, how families are impacted by any type of state violence, including lynching. So the video that I'm going to play for you now, this is Ethel Waters, and Ethel Waters was a blues and jazz singer during the early 20th century. You may have seen her in a couple of movies. I believe she was in Cabin in the Sky, which came out in the 1930s. But here she is singing a song written by Irving Berlin. And the title of that song is called Supper Time, and it was written in 1933. So I'll just play a little bit of that. And also notice the person that introduces Ethel Waters. She may look familiar to most of you.
When Irving Berlin wrote the score to the Broadway show, As Thousands Cheer, he composed one song especially for Ethel Waters. It's the story of a woman who just received word that her husband has been lynched by a frenzied mob. Here now, accompanied by Reginald Bean, is Miss Waters performing the unforgettable Supper Time.
I must set the table, 'cause it's supper time. Somehow I pause that man of mine ain't coming home no more. Kids will soon be supper time. How I keep from telling them that man of mine ain't coming home no more. How I keep explaining when they ask me where he's gone. How I keep from crying when I bring this supper on. How can I remind them?
Okay, I'll stop this here. But I love showing this video because it gives my students and myself to engage in the conversation again about the ripple effects of domestic violence on a family and really on a community. Again, here you have someone who is grieving on an everyday experience. And again, I think that conversation needs to be had when we think about lynching victims. Pieces of art that I like to use in describing lynching. This is by Winfred Rimberg, artist who recently passed, actually. And I like these 4 images, and I'll explain a little bit why. Because they give students, again, another visual. Again, I tend not to show a lot of lynching photos, the real ones, but I like to use art as a way to kind of communicate what violence looks like, what loss looks like, and what community activism may look like. So at the top here, so here where my cursor is, there are several scenes going on. Right here, if you look closely, you can see men carrying guns on horses. And if you look right here, you can see bodies hanging from a tree, right? So someone has been lynched. And here are the lynching participants. On the side, you can see this man with a white suit on and a hat. He represents the law. Again, police officers, local law enforcement are complicit in lynchings. And off to the side, and you can't, if you look closely, you can see members of an African-American community watching how this group of men are killing loved ones from their community. The second image here, you can see those same folks who had to bear witness a very violent act, removing their loved ones, whether it be their fathers, their mothers, their sisters, daughters, aunties, uncles, removing those bodies from trees. And that's another difficult labor and task that families will never forget. I think that when we think about lynchings, you just think about bodies hanging, but who has to do the hard work of taking those bodies down from trees? That's often done by relatives, families, the broader African-American community. And at the bottom, what we see here is a funeral or a homecoming service given by African-Americans to their loved ones. So I think Winfred Rimberg does an excellent job through his art of really captivating various scenes of lynching. And this is him right here. So let's talk just a little bit Wells. Ida B. Wells, who I think most people know, is an anti-lynching crusader. She was born in Holly Springs, Mississippi. She, like many people who are listening to me today, was a teacher. She was also a journalist. She was a member of the National Association of Colored Women. She was a founding member of the NAACP, and she owned a Black newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee. And the name of that newspaper was the Free Speech and Headlight, which was burnt down actually by a white mob. And a lot of times what we're seeing is when African Americans are talking about racism and white violence and disenfranchisement, we see, again, this is seen as a threat against the social order. So the types of articles that Ida B. Wells is publishing include articles condemn violence, interracial violence against Blacks, disenfranchisement, poor schools in the South, and the failure of Black people, particularly religious people, the clergy, to fight for their rights. She openly protested lynching against African Americans, particularly African American men. But Wells wrote two books. I think I mentioned these books a couple of weeks ago. One is entitled Southern Horrors, which I'll read a little bit from, Lynch Law in All Its Phases, which was published in 1892, and A Red Record, 1892 to 1894, which was published in 1895. So I just want to read a little bit about, a little bit from Southern Horrors. And then I want to read an interesting letter I found from Frederick Douglass to Wells about her work. Quote unquote, "It is with no pleasure I have dipped my hands in the corruption here exposed. Somebody must show that the Afro-American race is more sinned against than sinning, and it seems to have fallen upon me to do so. The awful death roll that Judge Lynch is calling every week is appalling, not only because of its lives it takes, the rank cruelty and outrage to the victims, but because of the prejudice it fosters and the stain it places against the good name of a weak race. The Afro-American is not a bestial race. If this work can contribute in any way towards proving this, and at this same time arouse the consciousness of the American people to demand justice for every citizen and punishment by law for the lawless, I shall feel I have done my race a service. Other considerations are of minor importance. She wrote this in 1892. So Frederick Douglass, in reading her book, praises her for her courage, just to step out and say these things, which again can be really threatening and dangerous for Black people, particularly Black women. So I'll just read a little bit of what Douglass said to Wells. Quote unquote, brave woman, you have done your people and mine a service which can neither be weighed nor measured. If American conscience were only half alive, if the American church and clergy were only half Christianized, if American moral sensibility were not hardened by persistent infliction of outrage and crime against colored people, a scream of horror and shame would rise to heaven wherever the pamphlet shall be raised. But alas, even crime has power to reproduce itself and create conditions favorable to its own existence. Thank you, dear sister. I think this letter to Wells from Douglass is just really, really beautiful. And it's again a testament to who Wells was as a not just as a club woman, not just as an anti-lynching crusader, but as someone who was a hardcore civil rights activist. I think in the introduction, it was a mention that I was the assistant editor of the Journal of African American History. And our recent issue, which was just published a couple of days ago, we actually have Wells on our cover. And I forgot to mention that Wells was a wife and she was a mother of several children. So while she's doing this really important race work, this really hard race work, she's also someone who is, again, a mother and a wife taking care of the home front. Now I want to play for you just a little cartoon that I like to play for my students. I think this would be definitely appropriate and useful for you to use in your classroom. So I'll just play a little bit and then I'll move on.
Exposing the horrors of racism in the American South wasn't easy, but investigative journalist Ida B. Wells made it her mission. Ida was born into slavery in 1862. After the Civil War, her family gained their freedom. Ida came of age during Reconstruction, a period of hope. But when she was 16, Ida's parents and baby brother tragically died in a yellow fever epidemic. At first, Ida cared for her younger siblings, but eventually moved in with her aunt in Memphis, Tennessee, where her career in journalism began. In 1889, Ida bought a share in the Memphis Free Speech and Headlight, becoming the first female co-owner and editor of a Black newspaper in the United States. Her goal was to create material about Black people for Black people. On March 9, 1892, a racist white mob lynched Ida's friend Thomas Moss and two of his colleagues. Thomas had run a successful grocery store, which the white people found threatening. Motivated by the horrific murder of her friend, Ida channeled her fear and anger into her work and started a crusade against lynching in America. It made Ida a target. When she wrote an editorial arguing that white women could, in fact, be attracted to Black men, challenging a key myth that racists used to justify their actions, a mob burned down her office, forcing Ida to flee to the north. There, Ida continued to raise awareness about the extent of lynching in America, something many people in the North simply did not know about. She documented 728 lynching cases between 1884 and 1892, wrote pamphlets to share her findings across the country, and in 1922, publicly supported an anti-lynching bill that went before Congress. Nearly a century later, Congress continues to debate legislation to make lynching a federal crime. As of 2019, only the House of Representatives had passed the bill. By using her pen to arouse the conscience of America, Ida B. Wells helped to expose racism and injustice and remains an inspiration to journalists everywhere.
A few more people I want to highlight before I talk about the anti-lynching legislation. Two other women that participated in discussions or debates about lynching were Jesse Ames and Rebecca Felton. So just a little bit about Jesse Ames. So Jesse Ames was from Texas. She was a suffragist. She was a club woman, very much like Ida B. Wells. She was an anti-lynching crusader. She challenged the notion that white women needed protection from Black men. This is her right here. She pointed out that the rationale that Black men were lynched because they desired white women was not true. And the motivation for lynching Black men was just plain old racial hatred. And sometime in the early 20th century, actually 1929, she established an organization called the Southern Women for the Prevention of Lynching. And here you have a woman who is not organizing necessarily within the African-American community. She is organizing white people, particularly white women, recruiting white women for the anti-lynching movement within her own community. She said, quote unquote, "We pledge ourselves to create a new public opinion in the South, which will not condone for any reason whatever acts of mobs or lynchings." So when we think about white women participating in the civil rights movement during, the mid 20th century, Ames is one of them. And I'll give you a few more examples really quickly. Another person is Anne Braden, who was a Mississippi freedom fighter. And her quote is really beautiful. "The fight against racism is not something we're called on to help people of color with. We need to become involved as if our lives depended on it, because in truth, they do." So most of these women, these liberal white women, and in Anne Braden's case, she's a Jewish American, many of them saw their freedom entangled with that of African Americans and other people of color. At the top here, we have I forgot her name, Joan Mulholland, another activist. And this is her. She was a 1960s freedom rider. And this is her at the bottom, holding up a sign. She was a member, she's still alive. She's a member of Delta Sigma Theta sorority, which is an African-American women's sorority. And I believe she was the first white woman to be initiated into Delta Sigma Theta. And at the top here, we have Viola Luiso, who was a Michigan civil rights activist who was politicized by what was happening in the South as it pertains to civil rights and as it pertained to African Americans being disenfranchised. And she leaves her home. She was a wife, she was a mother. Her husband was a Teamster, and she goes to the South to fight for civil rights. And unfortunately, she actually loses her life. She's murdered in the 1960s by members of the KKK, as well as the White Citizens Council. So women like Jesse Ames, sort of these anti-racist reformers, really paved the way for women that we see during the civil rights movement in the 1950s and also the 1960s. The other woman that I want to point your attention to is Rebecca Felton. And Rebecca Felton is not like Jesse Ames at all. Rebecca Felton was a wealthy woman from Georgia. She was a women's rights advocate. She was a journalist. She was a suffragist. So on paper, she is a liberal reformer, but she was also a defender of white supremacy and also a defender of the lynching of Black men. She believed that lynching was a necessary defense against white women's vulnerabilities in the face of Black men's propensity to rape and murder, and believed that white women were powerless against Black male, quote unquote, brutes. She continuously argued that it was the duty of white men to protect white women and to protect their virtue and bodies. So a direct quote from a 1897 speech about lynching of Black men by Rebecca Felton, quote unquote, "If it takes lynching to protect women's dearest possession from drunken, ravaging beasts," end quote, she said, quote, "then I say lynch 1,000 a day." So within lynching discourse, you have, these women who are, like Jesse Ames, who are reformers, who are interested in civil and human rights for African Americans. They are interested in dismantling white supremacy, and they are interested in stopping domestic violence and terror against African Americans. And at the same time, you have someone like Rebecca Felton, who actually becomes, I believe she becomes, and please check me on this, she's the first woman to serve in Congress only for 24 hours, representing the state of Georgia. I may have that wrong, so I'm sure someone will check me. I think it was the Senate, actually. And the lynching bill, right? The Dyer Act. So the Dyer Act, and this is who the Dyer Act is named after. This is Leonidas Dyer, who was a Republican representing the state of Missouri, who was a defender of the anti-lynching bill. So the Dyer Act, also known as the anti-lynching bill, defined lynching as the following, quote unquote, and this I'm reading directly from the act: the phase mob or assemblance when used in this act shall mean assemblage compared or composed of 3 or more, depriving any person of his life without the authority of law as a punishment or to prevent the commission of some actual or supposed public offense, end quote. So the legislation addressed lynching in 3 related parts. First, the act punished state and municipal officers who failed to do their duty in protecting the lives or person from the mob. The second, the act punished the perpetrators of the crime of lynching by federal prosecution. The third, the act compelled the county where the crime was committed to make compensation to the family to the tune of $10,000. The constitutionality validation for proposed legislation was found in the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. Because lynching was considered a private act, really, right? A private act outside of the law, the proponents argued that the state's officials' failure to uphold their sworn duties denied victims equal protection under the laws under the 14th Amendment. The opponents articulated based on historic relationship of state, local, and federal authority. They cited the traditional role of local authorities to retain jurisdiction to enforce state criminal statutes and oppose federal intrusion into this area. In other words, this is a states' rights argument, the same thing what we'll see with the Brown case. They did not address proponents' arguments that local authorities in allowing lynchings and abridged their constitutional enforcement duties. So this was the legislation that Ida B. Wells and others were trying to pass throughout the 20th century. Now we see that the Dyer Act was ultimately defeated by a Southern Democrat filibuster in December of 1922. So the act actually passes in Congress in 1922, but is stalled in the Senate. The next time we see an anti-lynching bill or any type of legislation that calls to make lynching a federal crime is not until 2022. Really quickly, I think I have a couple of minutes left. Again, here is the Ida B. Wells doll. I would also encourage people, if they love this doll, to also purchase the Madam C.J. Walker doll. Madam C.J. Walker was a beauty culturalist. The Tina Turner doll, which I just recently bought, actually. And there is a Mattel doll featuring Bessie Coleman. I'll save this for later. This is a great book for children. This is the Ida B. Wells book by her great-granddaughter, Ida B. the Queen. And this is also a personal friend of mine. Her name is Michelle Duster. And this is a book for children in elementary school as well as middle school. And if we're thinking about lynching and legislation again, I would bring your attention to the Senate apology for lynching in 2005 by Senator Mary Laundrie. This is also the same time when Congress makes an apology for slavery. This is around 2008, 2009. And the last thing that I'll mention is the Justice for Victims of Lynching Act, also known as the Emmett Till Lynching Act of 2022. The law carries a maximum sentence of 30 years in prison and fines for anyone conspiring to commit an act of lynching that causes death or harm. I know I'm out of my time. I see that Mrs. Garcia is up, but there's one last thing that I just want to say to everyone. Thank you to the Michigan Department of Education. This has been a really wonderful series to participate in. These series have shown the importance of why studying, researching, writing, and disseminating complicated, complex, and nuanced historical perspectives are worthy of and warrant public attention. I encourage all of us as knowledge producers to continue the hard fight and labor of teaching our students the truth about the American past while shining a light on historical and contemporary connections, especially amid a landscape of misinformation and an ongoing political attacks to hide and dismiss histories that have shown citizens' everyday struggles and victories to secure respect and citizenship and to live out their American dreams. Thank you for listening for over the past 3 weeks.
Thank you, Dr. Harris. Well said. Your presentations have been very powerful and critical to Michigan educators as they work to teach comprehensive history within their classrooms. And we at the Michigan Department of Education sincerely appreciate you creating this series in the support of this important effort. I want to also thank Dr. Rice, our state superintendent, for his vision and leadership in creating the Teaching Comprehensive History webinars. As Dr. Rice reminds us that as members of a diverse state, nation, and world, school staff and students need to know our rich and complex history. These powerful webinars, along with the provided resources, encourage Michigan educators and school leaders to deepen their knowledge so they may share with their students. As searing as some of our history is, we have the responsibility to teach it all. The next webinar series is a two-part series titled Disability Rights Movement. It continues on April 26th and May 3rd from 4 to 5 p.m. on each date. Please note that each webinar will present new content. We encourage educators to visit the Teaching Comprehensive History website. There's a link in the chat, and to register for each date to participate in future webinars. We invite you to register for these events if you have not already. Thank you for joining us today and for the work that you do on behalf of Michigan students. Please make sure to complete the survey for this event that will be emailed to you when today's webinar is closed. Have a great rest of your day.